The Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations will come to order. Today's hearing continues a 10-month bipartisan investigation of corruption, misconduct, and abuse at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta, a federal prison in the state of Georgia. The evidence the subcommittee has secured to date reveals stunning long-term failures of federal prison administration that likely contributed to loss of life, jeopardized the health and safety of inmates and staff, and undermined public safety and civil rights in the state of Georgia and the southeast region of the United States. The subcommittee has secured and reviewed thousands of pages of internal documents from the Bureau of Prisons and interviewed dozens of witnesses, including BOP whistleblowers, current and former staff, federal judges, federal defenders, and former senior leaders at the Bureau of Prisons. The investigation has revealed that gross misconduct persisted at this prison for at least 9 years, and that much of the damning information revealing misconduct, abuse, and corruption was known to BOP and accessible to BOP leadership during that period. For many years, this facility has been extremely dangerous and insecure. Correctional services staff at USPA engaged in misconduct with impunity, and according to BOP's own internal investigations, lacked regard for human life. Vast quantities of contraband, including weapons and narcotics, flowed through the prison, enabled by staff corruption. Conditions for inmates and pretrial detainees have been abusive and inhumane, and in my view, violated both the Eighth Amendment right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. Interviews and records reveal a facility where inmates, including presumptively innocent pretrial detainees, were denied proper nutrition, access to clean drinking water and hygiene products, lacked access to medical care, endured months of lockdowns with limited or no access to the outdoors or basic services, and had rats and roaches in their food and cells. One federal judge told the subcommittee that USPA is an embarrassment to the judicial system and noted that incarceration at USPA is like adding another layer of punishment due to the appalling conditions. Another federal judge wrote a letter to the USPA warden in January of this year to express his deep concern regarding the persistently abusive conditions that were reported to him, including detainees subjected to, quote, a month of 24-hour solitary confinement with only a Bible for entertainment or reading, quote, no change of clothes for several weeks, quote, lack of access to mail, quote, a week with only a paper jumpsuit and paper blankets for an inmate on suicide watch, and, quote, blockage of written communications between attorney and client. Given these conditions, it is perhaps not surprising that USPA has led the nation's federal prison facilities in suicides, and 4 of the last 4 inmates deceased from suicide were found to have been using narcotics at the time of their death. This despite repeated warnings from BOP's own investigators that the prison was failing to prevent the flow of contraband into the facility, failing to implement suicide prevention policies, failing to respond with urgency to suicide attempts by inmates, and that there was a lack of, and I quote, regard for human life among the staff, and this is another direct quote from BOP's own internal investigations, quote, a dangerous and chaotic environment of hopelessness and helplessness, leaving inmates to their own means to improve their quality of life. In a November 2020 suicide investigation report, one of thousands of pages of documents that this subcommittee unearthed, BOP's own investigators found that the staff's delayed medical response, quote, represents gross indifference to preserving life and violates inmates' constitutional rights. That from the BOP's own internal investigators. Since at least 2014, BOP leadership was warned in its own internal audits and investigations, documents secured by this subcommittee, that failures and misconduct were persistent and severe. Failures documented during this period include failures to conduct rounds in the special housing unit, improper handling and management of firearms, failures to search for contraband, failures to train staff in suicide prevention, improper storage of large quantities of narcotics, the free and open flow of contraband within the facility, including in the special housing unit, mishandling of evidence related to inmate suicides, inoperable surveillance cameras, inoperable perimeter security infrastructure. Here are some direct quotes, again, from the BOP's own internal audits which this subcommittee secured. Quote, complacency, indifference, inattentiveness, and a lack of compliance with BOP policies and procedures. Quote, a lack of oversight throughout the institution. Quote, USP Atlanta presents significant security concern for the Southeast region. Both national and local policies are being violated on a regular basis. Again, the BOP's own internal investigations in reports available to BOP leadership for years. In one instance cited by BOP internal investigators, prison staff had to borrow a razor blade from a prisoner to cut the ligature suspending that prisoner who had hanged himself in his cell. In another instance, officers intentionally disabled drug detection equipment used to identify trace amounts of narcotics coming into the prisons at one of the entrances. Yet despite these unequivocal internal reports of abuse and misconduct, the situation continued to deteriorate. Today, our witnesses include two individuals with more than 45 years of combined experience working within the Bureau of Prisons and several years working at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta. Dr. Ramirez, who comes forward today as a whistleblower, previously served as the chief psychologist at USPA and remains employed by the BOP. Ms. Whitehead previously served as the jail administrator at USP Atlanta and recently retired after nearly 30 years of service. Dr. Ramirez, Ms. Whitehead, I applaud your courage in coming forward to speak publicly about your experiences working at the U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta and in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I know this was not an easy decision for you, and I know I speak for the subcommittee on a bipartisan basis when I say that we are grateful for your bravery today, and we will look harshly upon and seek accountability for any retaliation you may experience as a result of your testimony. Our investigation is also about the impact of corruption and dysfunction at USP Atlanta on the criminal justice system and the rights of incarcerated people. Many of these individuals subjected to these conditions have not gone to trial or been convicted of any crime. They are presumptively innocent pretrial detainees. And today we will hear from Ms. Shepard, an experienced federal defender, who will testify about her client's experiences at USPA. Later, we will hear from Bureau of Prisons Director Michael Carvajal, who was the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs from 2018 until 2020, with oversight over correctional services nationwide, and who has served as Director of the agency since 2020. Director Carvajal's testimony is critical to our ongoing investigation. After months of bipartisan requests for Director Carvajal's voluntary testimony, on July 14th, the subcommittee issued a subpoena to compel it. As an accommodation to the Department of Justice and in recognition of Director Carvajal's presence this morning, this subpoena has been withdrawn, and Director Carvajal is testifying today on a voluntary basis. My preference is always to pursue investigations in a cooperative spirit and without resorting to compulsory process. However, so long as I chair this subcommittee, it will continue vigorously, professionally, and judiciously to pursue these investigations in the public interest. And where necessary, the subcommittee will use all of its authorities to pursue the information vital to that work. Today is the next step in our investigation, but not the last. I thank Ranking Member Johnson and his staff for their continued cooperation during this bipartisan investigation. At this hearing, there will be discussion of some difficult topics concerning treatments of people suffering from mental illness and suicide. I want to note that people experiencing mental health crisis or thoughts of suicide can call a new nationwide hotline, 988, to be connected with trained counselors. I thank again the ranking member for his cooperation and yield to him for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the witnesses for your appearance here. Dr. Ramirez in particular, I just want to say that we will unequivocally protect you from any retaliation that you may suffer because of this. I think the chairman has done a very good job of summarizing the issues that we've uncovered here. I want to commend both the chairman and your staff and my staff for doing a really pretty thorough investigation here. I know We weren't able to issue the report because we didn't get cooperation. But we will be issuing the report, and I'm looking forward to that. I think it will be also very complete. So again, I just want to commend everybody involved in this. And as Chairman, I would like to just enter my opening statement in the record, because it would just repeat an awful lot of what you said, but I would like to spend a couple minutes here just describing the fact, I didn't come to the United States Senate to be an investigator. I came here because we're mortgaging our kids' future, and we still are. But when I became chairman of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, a lot of people don't realize it because it's not in the title. That is the Senate's Oversight Committee. And you have a responsibility to start looking into things and conducting oversight and do investigations. Now, of course, being ranking member on the permanent subcommittee investigations, that's what we do. I would hope this experience has started opening up your eyes. My 6 years as chairman of the committee certainly opened up my eyes at how weakened congressional oversight has become over the years. We have very limited enforcement power. As a result, the agencies just thumb their nose at us. And I think you saw that here. These are legitimate issues. These are long-standing problems. The fact that the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Prisons, weren't fully cooperating in this is absurd. I held a hearing as chairman of the full committee on the Bureau of Prisons. I asked in 2018 for an investigation by the Office of Inspector General. We still don't have that report. I guess it's still in progress. This is in 2018. So again, this hearing again is long overdue. This is on specifically with Atlanta, but we ought to be asking, how prevalent is this? But because the agencies are not transparent, because they're not cooperating, we need whistleblowers coming forward. And this is my appeal to anybody in federal agencies who have worked diligently with integrity for your agencies. If you're working for an agency that has lost its credibility, is not operating with integrity, please come forward. We need to hear you. The only way this is going to get corrected, the agencies, the departments are not going to correct their own problems. They're not going to make them public. And the only way these problems are corrected is if they are made public, and that is with congressional oversight and public exposure. And so we need whistleblowers. I have to highlight an extraordinary letter written yesterday by Senator Chuck Grassley involving a joint investigation we've been conducting for a couple of years. Finally, some whistleblowers have come forward, and quite honestly, I don't know if they're from the FBI, the Department of Justice, but it is extraordinary what he reveals in his letter to FBI Director Wray and Attorney General Garland. To quote, "There was a scheme in place among certain FBI officials to undermine derogatory information connected to Hunter Biden by falsely suggesting it was disinformation." Now, I don't want to go too far into this. This is not necessarily the forum for this, but it's exactly the forum to encourage more whistleblowers to come forward, because one of the reasons this is so near and dear to my heart is both Senator Grassley and I were falsely accused of accepting and disseminating Russian disinformation. Is this where this came from? Did those false accusations against the chairman of Senate committees duly authorized with responsibility to conduct oversight and investigations, were we smeared and undermined by our own FBI? I'd like to enter this Senator Grassley's letter in the record. I'd also like to enter the letter I wrote to Attorney General Garland, to Christopher Wray, to Director of National Intelligence Haynes, as well as Inspector General Horowitz. I'd also like to enter that in the record.
Without objection.
So again, if you are a whistleblower in the Department of Justice, the FBI, please come forward. If you want to restore integrity and credibility to your agencies, come forward and tell Congress so the American people understand the truth. I would also make that appeal to people working in our federal health agencies. Our response to COVID has been a miserable failure, largely because our health agencies have not been transparent. I've written 43 oversight letters to the agencies. Where I've gotten responses, they're non-responsive responses. Generally, I don't even get answers. This lack of transparency must end. We must restore congressional oversight because the American people deserve the truth. You know, every one of these confirmed secretaries or agency heads come before Congress, they raise their hand, and they swear that they will comply with legitimate congressional oversight, and then they don't. This has to end. The American people deserve transparency, they deserve honesty, they deserve the truth. So again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the work you've done on this. This was important information. The only way this is going to get fixed in Atlanta, in other prisons, is if people, the American public, is aware of what's going on. Because obviously the Bureau of Prisons isn't fixing it. They haven't fixed it. This requires public pressure, and that requires congressional oversight. So, you know, again, I commend you for drawing a line and insisting on cooperation. We didn't get it. We finally got it the 12th hour. But this is exactly what's required. And again, I'm hoping you're now realizing, again, just a fraction of the frustration I've been feeling for 6 years, trying to get to the bottom and trying to provide the American people the truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson, and appreciate your will to investigate issues in the Bureau of Prisons at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta and indeed at other facilities, and we'll continue that work together. We will now call our first panel of witnesses for this morning's hearing. Dr. Erica Ramirez, a current Bureau of Prisons employee and the former chief psychologist at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta. Ms. Terry Whitehead, retired from the Bureau of Prisons after more than 30 years of service. She served most recently as jail administrator at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta before retiring in December of 2021. And Ms. Rebecca Shepard is a trial attorney with the Federal Defender Program in the Northern District of Georgia, whose office has frequently represented inmates at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. I appreciate all of you being with us this morning, and especially want to thank you for the courage to come forward and speak out. We look forward to your testimony, and it is the custom of this subcommittee to swear in all witnesses. So at this time, I would ask all of you to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may take your seats. We will be using a timing system today. All of your written testimony will be printed in the record in its entirety, and we would ask that you try to limit your oral testimony to no longer than 5 minutes. We will begin with you, Dr. Ramirez. You may deliver your opening statement.
Good morning. It is my professional and personal honor to participate in this hearing. I'm here today seeking accountability for the appalling situation at United States Penitentiary Atlanta. Once the flagship of the BOP, it is now a penitentiary in name only. As a chief psychologist at USP Atlanta from 2018 to 2021, I repeatedly reported ongoing, uncorrected, gross mismanagement of suicide prevention practices, staff misconduct, and general operational deficiencies. Unfortunately, the only response I received was unlawful retaliation. I was involuntarily transferred to an FCI in Seagoville, Texas. Though I'm speaking today in my personal capacity, I have been an employee of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for 15 years. For the first 11, I was assigned to various psychology departments at high or maximum security male institutions. From 2015 to 2018, I was a psychologist with a supervisory role in the Supermax, also known as the ADX, the facility in Florence, Colorado, the most secure institution in the country. In 2018, I accepted the chief psychologist position at USP Atlanta, where my mission was to turn around a deficient, failing psychology department. I was responsible for integrating standardized procedures on inmate mental health issues, the provision of sound clinical care to the inmate population, developing and implementing mental health treatment and best practices, and tracking and analyzing program adherence. Like most BOP employees, I am first and foremost a federal law enforcement officer. In addition to providing mental health care, I'm responsible for ensuring the safety and security of the community, the staff, and the inmate population. That includes pat-downs, searches, and other security-related duties. Upon my arrival, and for the duration of my time at USP Atlanta, the facility was falling apart. Elevators were inoperable for months at a time. The walls were infested with mold. Whenever it rained, the sewer would back up and overflow onto the recreation yard, sometimes leaving a foot of human waste behind. Security-wise, there was little to speak of. Given the volume and flagrancy of the contraband, it was obvious that cell searches were not being properly conducted, if at all. For instance, I confiscated a microwave that I found while searching an inmate's cell. 2 days later, I found the same microwave in another cell. It was the same serial number. Of course, my assignment and primary concern was the inmate mental health and suicide prevention. In the roughly 4 years, 8 inmates at USP Atlanta died by suicide, 2 prior to my arrival and 6 during my tenure. To put this into perspective, federal prisons typically see between 1 and 3 suicides over a 5-year period. Any loss of life is tragic and unacceptable, which is why it is particularly devastating to see such disregard for human life at USP Atlanta. BOP policy requires that a suicide reconstruction team is sent to investigate circumstances of any inmate suicide. The team prepares a report detailing findings and making recommendations to prevent reoccurrences. This report is sent to on-site, regional, and national offices in the BOP, and the institution must provide a written response to any recommendations. While at USP Atlanta, I reviewed 7 reconstruction reports, each prepared by different teams, and all 7 reports featured some same issues. Inmates suffering from ongoing substance abuse, easy access to drugs, unit rounds which were required to be done every half hour were routinely skipped for hours at a time. I repeatedly expressed my concerns about other systematic failings to management, and nothing was done. Despite desperate need for reform, any suggestion for change was met with resistance. That's not the Atlanta way. Some of the examples of the Atlanta way included an employee yelling threats and obscenities, aggressively approaching an executive staff member. Though I was 5 months pregnant and terrified, I stepped between the two and pushed the employee away. I reported the employee, and nothing was done. Another time, my husband was repeatedly hit by a staffer. He required medical attention, and the attacker remained at work. I was warned to stay away from him. In 2020, a program review team found that the staff had broken machines intended to detect traces of drugs. This had been going on for a year. The agency's response was to move 43 mid-level supervisors across the countries. It was during the midst of the COVID pandemic. Our families had set down roots, and we had done nothing wrong. The agency refused to give us responses. Today, I'm asking that you help this agency, staff it at 100%, provide mid-level management with tools to actually make changes. We have lots of responsibility, and yet we have little authority. When there is discipline, make it fair and swift. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez. Ms. Whitehead, you may now deliver your opening statement.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. Who am I and why am I here? I am an upper management retiree after serving more than 30 years with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I am here because of the many abuses and gross management I personally witnessed while serving at USP Atlanta. I was shocked and appalled by the USP Atlanta big picture. On a daily basis, there were numerous policy violations which put the staff, inmates, and the local community in danger. For example, there were so many rats inside the facility dining hall and food preparation areas that staff intentionally left doors open so the many stray cats that hung around the prison could catch the rats. It is never a good idea to leave prison doors open. There was no professional pest control service in place because management officials could not work together and determine which department or budget was responsible for the cost. I arrived at USP Atlanta in August 2020, 6 months into the pandemic, and at that time, staff were not provided appropriate PPE to perform their duties within the pandemic. Also, there were no designated COVID-19 isolation or quarantine areas in the detention center unit. In August 2020, it was reported half of the 300 security cameras did not operate appropriately, and the other half were off by 3 hours. This was not the first time this had been reported. There were missing security controls and equipment to include keys, handcuffs, and pepper spray. Key control at other BOP facilities that I have worked is paramount to maintaining safety and security. Then there is the Atlanta way. The Atlanta way is far from norm and certainly not the Bureau of Prisons way. Most of the staff at USP Atlanta are very proud that Atlanta does things intentionally different. The BOP has a policy on staff conduct and ethics. Reports of unethical behavior must be investigated, and if warranted, discipline is imposed. However, at USP Atlanta, the Atlanta way is where staff are not held accountable for misconduct. Inmates are not challenged for negative behavior, and regular maintenance and routine repairs are non-existent. Staff members are actually involved in physical fights at work, which cases are uninvestigated and or staff subsequently promoted within. Marijuana is routinely smelled inside the prison, but there are no searches to determine which inmates were smoking. Inmates are observed in zombie state, and nothing is done in an effort to determine the source of the illegal substances. All BOP staff members are correctional workers first, to include secretaries, psychologists, teachers, and wardens. Conducting searches is Corrections 101 at BOP facilities. I never saw a pat search conducted at USP Atlanta. And in August 2020 and July 2021, reports indicate area searches were not being done. As the jail administrator at USP Atlanta, I tried to make positive changes by voluntarily training less experienced staff, by correcting security violations, and reporting staff misconduct. My efforts were very unappreciated. I was ostracized by staff. I was victimized by the agency with a forced relocation to a Texas facility, which led to my retirement much earlier than planned. In August 2021, the pseudo-solution to addressing the USP Atlanta problems was to move 43 management officials out of 432 staff members. What I witnessed was outrageous. I never expected to be here today. Now that I am, I ask for your immediate help. I truly believe the problems can be fixed with the right people and mindset. Please continue the kind of oversight you are doing today. Hopefully, it will result in real accountability and stop the abuses you are hearing about. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Whitehead. Ms. Shepard, you may now deliver your opening statement. And to our panelists, you may hear buzzes and bells from the camera, and they have nothing to do with you or your time. They're just indicators of what's happening on the floor, so don't be alarmed. Ms. Shepard.
Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to this hearing. Today, I focus my testimony on the unacceptable conditions of confinement for clients who are detained pre-trial, awaiting trial, and presumed innocent at USP Atlanta. Defenders see firsthand how USP Atlanta subjects people to inhumane and substandard conditions and limits their access to attorneys, which in turn interferes with their Sixth Amendment right to counsel. The result is deplorable and punitive conditions which courts, defenders, and our clients have observed for decades. I want to begin by sharing a clear picture of what life inside is like. One client, and I will call him Jacob for the purpose of this hearing, described his experience in a 2019 affidavit that I've submitted as Exhibit B. Jacob was held in an overcrowded pod where he was locked into his cell for 24 hours a day, 3 to 4 days at a time. He was one of 3 people squeezed into a 2-person cell. When Jacob was allowed outside of his cell, it was for less than an hour every few days. The pod only had 6 showers and 3 phones that had to be shared by about 100 people, making it impossible for everyone to shower and make phone calls. When out of his cell, Jacob had to choose whether to call his family or to call his attorney, but he could not do both. Even worse, Jacob's cell was infested with roaches, and when he asked for cleaning supplies, the guards merely laughed. I'm sorry to say that Jacob's experience is not at all unique for Atlanta pretrial detainees. During my 8 years as a defender, I have seen clients routinely locked down and allowed out of their cells for extremely limited periods of time, such as only 15 to 30 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week, or only an hour each day. And these lockdowns persist for months. Clients are treated as though they are in solitary confinement, not because of their behavior, but because of their misfortune in being placed at USP Atlanta. Lockdowns mean that my clients cannot meet their basic human needs, cannot communicate with their families, cannot visit with clergy, and cannot participate in productive programming. Jacob also described receiving substandard food and hygiene at USP Atlanta. His dinner was routinely slices of bread and packages of expired deli meat, and he could not supplement his diet with commissary because it was limited to only instant coffee and potato chips. Again, Jacob's experience is not unique. Our clients go months at a time with only sack lunches provided for every meal served in their cells. Sometimes they find bugs in their food, and we see the impact as our clients lose weight and become emaciated. Given these fundamental failures of care, it should come as no surprise that USP Atlanta routinely denies our clients access to mental health treatment, including medication, therapy, and access to mental health professionals. As Chairman Ossoff referenced earlier, one person on pretrial detention was held for a week on suicide watch without access to treatment or medication, provided only a paper gown and paper blankets. I want to turn to a different topic next, which is how USP Atlanta interferes with the Sixth Amendment guarantee of effective assistance of counsel. USP Atlanta's practices and policies do not allow us to fulfill our constitutional and ethical obligations of zealous advocacy. First, there are scheduling delays and difficulties as USP Atlanta staff members fail to respond to requests for legal meetings, often for several days and despite repeated requests. It is not unusual for the date of the expected meeting to pass and for there to still be no response from staff members. And scheduling a meeting does not mean that the meeting will actually happen because of the facility's chaos and disorganization. When we do get to meet with our clients, it is often after hours of waiting. And while we wait, we are on the clock, along with the experts and interpreters that often come along with us. So taxpayers are bearing the cost of USP Atlanta's incompetence. Clients' access to their discovery, the government's evidence against them, is also limited because clients do not have enough access to the law library due to the lockdowns and have no ability to review electronic discovery with their attorneys. Even when a court has intervened and ordered USP Atlanta to allow law library access, the facility has failed to comply. The circumstances that we detail today are inhumane and unjust, but they are avoidable and they should not be the norm. Unfortunately, the problems at USP Atlanta are part of a larger story of systemic dysfunction. My written statement includes several recommendations for ways this body could address this unconscionable state of affairs. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Shepard, and to all of our panelists. I'll now begin with my first round of questions. And Ms. Shepard, I'd like to begin with you. I'm going to enter into the record a letter from Judge Timothy C. Batten, Chief United States District Judge, Northern District of Georgia, to the warden at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta from just January of this year. Now, our review of internal BOP records demonstrates that a pattern of misconduct and dysfunction persists at least as far back as 2014 at this facility. This is from January of this year. The judge asks the warden for answers with respect to reports of rats in the building, roaches in the food, poor nutrition and emaciation of inmates, lack of access to hygiene products, lack of access to medication, lack of access to mail, limited access to toothbrush and toothpaste, no change of clothes for several weeks, a month of 24-hour solitary confinement with only a Bible for entertainment or reading, a week, as you mentioned, with only a paper jumpsuit and paper blankets for an inmate on suicide watch without mental health treatment, only being permitted 15 minutes out of a cell every day to bathe, make phone calls, and use the library, blockage of written and other communications between attorney and client, difficulty arranging interview between inmate and psychologist. I mean, is this consistent with your experience, and what does this say about the state of affairs? This is just in the jail at U.S. Penitentiary. I want to remind everyone, these are presumptively innocent pretrial detainees. These conditions would be appalling if any human being were subjected to them. We're talking about people who have been convicted, not of the crime they've been charged, if any crime at all. Would you please comment?
Yes, Chairman Ossoff, that is representative of our experience. We have observed the same conditions that are detailed in that letter. And I would like to make clear to the subcommittee that these are not conditions that were created or result from the COVID-19 pandemic. These are conditions that we have seen for as long as I have been going to USP Atlanta, which dates back to 2014, and for my colleagues even further back. And they've also been reflected in records established in front of the district court as well as in front of the 11th Circuit.
Well, I cited in my opening statement a note in a BOP internal investigative document, the BOP's own staff stating on the record that they believed misconduct in the prison constituted a violation of constitutional rights. What do these conditions mean for access to counsel, the Sixth Amendment right that every defendant has to be in consultation with their attorney and receive effective counsel?
As I alluded to in my earlier statement, it is difficult to the point of, in some cases, impossible for us as attorneys to communicate with our clients. There are extremely lengthy delays in even our clients receiving legal mail. But it is a necessary part of our representation of our clients to meet with them, to discuss the evidence against them, to discuss what their legal strategy will be. All of those conversations require contact with our clients. It is not unusual for it to take several weeks, if not longer, to even schedule an opportunity to go into the facility. And again, when we do get into the facility, our time with our clients is extremely limited, largely due to the chaos and dysfunction that exists within the facility. Getting into the facility, being processed in, there's often, even if we have an approval from an administrator to come for the meeting, the people at the front gate don't have that. They didn't know we were coming. No one is assigned to actually monitor the meeting. All of those delays end up creating a situation where our time with our clients is extremely limited. And the consequence of that is that then hearings that the court has scheduled often have to be delayed. It is not unusual for us to have to ask the judge for continuance after continuance after continuance because we are not able to prepare for a hearing or to file motions because we simply don't have access.
Thank you, Ms. Shepard. Dr. Ramirez, I want to talk about access to narcotics in the facility, the impact on mental health. I noted that internal BOP reports that the subcommittee secured dating back as far as 2014 noted severe deficiencies in the ability to manage and prevent the flow of contraband and including drugs and weapons throughout the facility. I noted an event in the last 5 years when BOP's own internal investigators found that the staff had deliberately disabled a spectrometer meant to detect trace amounts of narcotics entering the facility. In the summer of 2021, this is just in very recent past, after 8 or 9 years of BOP's internal reports noting the failure to prevent contraband, there were seized heroin, methamphetamine, Suboxone, marijuana, tobacco, more than 100 instances that summer of locating narcotics, ecstasy, synthetic marijuana, K2, not to mention a kilogram of marijuana found in a locked education storage closet, 300 grams of marijuana found on a work site, 158 pills of a variety of loose prescriptions, 170 grams of methamphetamine in a common area, weapons, nearly 500 cell phones, all inside the facility, all found in a few sweeps in the summer of 2021. Please describe the problem at USP Atlanta with respect to access to narcotics and how it intersects with your work in mental health and the suicides that you saw while you were there.
So unfortunately, the ease of access to drugs makes it very difficult for mental health providers to differentiate between genuine mental illness and the effects of whatever unknown substance the individual may be on. So we spend much of our time initially assessing, what the individual's experiencing. Is this because of drugs? Have you had depression? It takes much longer to kind of tease out whether this is an organic issue or something created by a chemical that was recently ingested. Unfortunately, the lack of security, routine searches, routine drug testing is such that we can't, we always have to assume that the inmate is intoxicated and that it is not necessarily presenting an organic mental illness. So it certainly creates a delay in developing a treatment plan and moving forward in how to best help that individual.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez. And the suicide investigation reports that the subcommittee secured over many years reveal negligent staff responses to suicides in progress, negligent staff conduct before, during, and after suicides. This is April 2016. Correctional services staff had failed to locate the inmate for his scheduled mental health treatment. Census counts were not being properly conducted and documented. October 2017, this is a quote, "Staff responded with no apparent sense of urgency to the inmate hanging in his cell, logged no rounds on the shoe that day. No evidence pertaining to the suicide was retained." This is the BOP's own internal findings. Another suicide, October 2019. Rounds on the shoe were not performed, a delay in the initiation of life-saving measures, mishandling of evidence again. My final question, with the ranking member's indulgence, Ms. Whitehead, for you, staff misconduct, staff failure to follow policy. Based upon your experience, how deficient were the management processes that should have caused staff to adhere to BOP policies and procedures? And once you're concluded, it'll be ranking member's turn. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Senator. As I said, the BOP has a policy on misconduct. And the way it happens, if it's observed, you write a memo, you report it. I personally have reported maybe 6 instances when I was at Atlanta in about 16 months. I was never interviewed. There are fights, staff fight each other, physical fights in the prison. Those cases are not investigated. There are staff that curse each other in the presence of inmates. I've witnessed it. I've reported it. I've never been interviewed. So when staff don't report to work, they're AWOL. 300 hours of AWOL, and that staff member continues to go to work. Without a system of controls in place to curb misconduct among staff, the inmates feel that they can do whatever they want to do.
Thank you, Ms. Whitehead. Ranking Member Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Shepard, quickly, you are generally dealing with people in pretrial detention, correct?
My testimony was focused on that. We also represent, for example, I have a client right now who is charged with committing a criminal act while inside the facility. So we have different sorts of access.
So are those individuals separated, those populations, pretrial detainees versus the general prison population?
Yes, and there's also an additional population at the facility, which is transferees. So inmates who are being transferred from one BOP facility to another. Those should also be separated. I have seen clients who were pretrial who were in the same pod or unit as transferees, people who were already serving a sentence.
So I mean, the whole prison sounds like a horror show, but is it particularly broken in terms of pretrial detention, or is there really no difference?
I believe that's accurate, yes. It is particularly the egregious lockdown conditions that I've described, the egregious nutrition and hygiene conditions that I've described are specific to pretrial detainees.
Okay. Ms. Whitehead, I'm deaf in one ear and you're very soft-spoken, so if you could get your microphone a little bit closer to you so I can hear better. You obviously have served in a number of prisons around the country. I think my main question to you is, how extraordinary, how out of the ordinary is Atlanta and the Atlanta way versus other situations you've been in?
As I indicated, I was shocked. I was appalled by the conditions at Atlanta. Cell phones. In July 2021, approximately 700 cell phones were recovered in a sweep in Atlanta.
Just quickly, while we're on describe why that's such a problem in a prison.
Inmates are not allowed to have cell phones in a prison. Inmates can actually call hits on anybody outside of the prison using a cell phone. Cell phones are not monitored. Inmates can make drug transactions, commit further crime utilizing a cell phone.
So again, that's a big problem when you have 700 cell phones in a prison.
That is
but
a huge
go on.
problem. Cell phones are in other institutions. To put it in perspective, there may be one cell phone to 50 inmates at another institution. Atlanta had approximately 1,400 inmates and 700 phones were found. That's one to every other inmate.
So you started your career in Atlanta.
I did.
And then, I don't want to age you or anything, but you had a career all over the country, and then you came back really at the tail end of your career. Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea how long conditions were as you found them? Is this something that had been going on for years?
When I started my career at USP Atlanta as an intern, I was learning the Bureau way, not the Atlanta. I was learning the Bureau. I traveled about 8 institutions over 30 years, gathering knowledge, learning policies. And I went back to Atlanta. I was very proud to go back to Atlanta. When I got to Atlanta and I saw that Atlanta operated totally different from other institutions, it was a shocking moment that Atlanta is far off the grid when it comes to the BOP.
So there are problems at other Bureau of Prisons, but nothing like Atlanta.
Not that I've experienced.
Not even close. Dr. Ramirez, there's generally somebody in charge. I mean, there's some leader, leader of the pack, so to speak. There's somebody generally in charge. My guess is not necessarily the warden. I mean, do you either of you know who's in charge there, really? I mean, who created the Atlanta Way?
I think the Atlanta Way has been ongoing for many, many years, long before I started my bureau and probably even before Ms. Whitehead. In my experience at USP Atlanta, I think the warden, though identified as the leader per se, has very little authority. The Southeast Regional Office, where the regional director is about 12 miles away. And from my experience, that office had a lot of input and oversight into what was going on in the institution, though they may or may not have been informed about the details and minutia of what was going on at the institution. So I think it's kind of divided.
So I realize the sensitivity of my sensitive nature of my question here, because I'm shocked, quite honestly, how much retaliation we actually see within government agencies. So I understand the fear, but I'm trying to determine who's in the end responsible for this. I mean, you can say the director, you can say the warden. I'm trying to figure out exactly why this continued to go on and on and on. I know both you and Ms. Whitehead attempted to report these things. Who did you report this to?
I reported it both to the warden and the regional director. In some cases, as it related to the suicides, it was reported to central office, DC. I think a lot of what you're seeing is years and years of staff and management not being held accountable. So it enables further misconduct, almost making it normal.
So when you report that to the warden or somebody at the regional center, is your assessment they were fully aware of this? They just realized there's nothing they were going to do about it or could do about it, and they just sort of ignored your concerns?
Yeah, my assessment was they were fully aware. I know they were fully aware because I advised them myself. In many cases, I believe they chose to take no action because it was far more difficult to take action than to look the other way.
Would those people in charge, would they be in fear of retaliation themselves? And not necessarily career retaliation, but physical retaliation from people in the prison?
In my opinion, I don't believe that they would be in fear of physical retaliation, but I do believe that the regional director is a political position to some degree, and there is quite a bit of caution when attempting to address misconduct.
So with your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Whitehead, can you bring some context to, I think you understand the thrust of my questions here. When there are ongoing problems, it goes on and on and on, and people are aware of it, but they're just not simply addressing it. Can you explain why?
It appears the problems in Atlanta have been growing for years. Atlanta has a reputation. At one point, it was the flagship of the Bureau of Prisons. Atlanta has a reputation. There's the Atlanta way. Typically, wardens will make a round through Atlanta maybe 2 to 3 years. They have a career to keep growing. If you go to Atlanta and you per se rock the boat, or you don't go along with the Atlanta way, then it can ruin your career.
I'm just, so the people that report to you as the warden, they would be able to ruin your career if you don't discipline them and correct what's happening at the prison. Is that? Again, I'm trying to understand this.
So the warden does have limited ability to make change, particularly at Atlanta. The regional director, which is the warden's supervisor, has more stake or more weight in making change in Atlanta. If the warden goes against the regional director's view of Atlanta, then the warden's going to be moved.
Okay, so it really, the responsibility really falls more on the regional director's shoulders than the warden's shoulders.
More safe for Atlanta.
How would you, okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You know, the ranking member's line of question brings to mind, I think, something that's important that we establish here today, which is that these issues are long-standing, and these issues have been known to the BOP. This information has been accessible to BOP leadership dating back at least 9 years, according to the records that we secured from the Bureau of Prisons. All the way back in 2014, we have internal BOP documents warning about deficiencies in suicide prevention practices, Dr. Ramirez at the facility. And yet, a full 6 years later, November of 2020, here's something from a suicide investigation, U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta. Quote, past reconstruction teams, the teams that conduct these investigations, this report reads, past reconstruction teams have made many of the same recommendations noted below in this report. The need for attention to detail, adherence to BOP policy, and regard for human life among correctional services staff. Regard for human life among correctional services staff. All right, here's another report, another suicide, about 8 months later. Quote, once again, this reconstruction revealed complacency, indifference, inattentiveness, and lack of compliance with BOP policies and procedures. These lapses contributed to a dangerous and chaotic environment of hopelessness and helplessness, leaving inmates to their own means to improve their quality of life. What does it mean in a prison, Dr. Ramirez, if the correctional services staff, and these are not my words, folks, these are the words of the BOP's own internal investigators, lack a regard for human life?
It makes it impossible for psychology services or even health services to do their job. We are all one team, but certainly custody and correctional services is the backbone of any institution. If they are not doing the minimum, we are then unable to provide the treatment necessary to help improve mental health across the institution. If we can't stop inmates from accessing substances, from engaging in self-harm routinely and having access to various contraband, we cannot provide them mental health services. It makes it impossible, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez. Ms. Shepard, the impact on the physical health of those incarcerated at this facility, and again, I want to keep emphasizing this, that particularly in your case, we're talking about pre-trial detainees. Let me be clear that there is no excuse for this treatment and abuse of any human being in any facility of the United States government or in the world. When we're talking about pre-trial detainees, we're talking about folks who are being held before or during their cases are being tried. They've not been convicted. They are presumptively innocent. We heard from a federal judge that so depraved are the conditions at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta that if folks are convicted and sentenced, they depart downward from the sentencing guidelines because they consider incarceration at this facility to be punishment upon punishment. I'd like for you to describe what you've seen in terms of the impact on detainees and inmates' health of lack of access to nutrition, clean water, and so on.
We see this on a regular basis with clients who are detained pretrial at USP Atlanta. Significant changes, not only in physical health, but also in mental health. In terms of physical health, we see, as I described earlier, clients who are losing weight, losing muscle mass, sleep deprived. All of those take a very physical toll on our clients' health, and we see that, and we point that out to the judges to help them understand and explain what these clients are subject to that is different, that is not, it's not what we expect out of federal pretrial detention, and it's not what clients at different federal pretrial detention centers within the district experience. But there's also a significant toll on their mental health. The extreme isolation of being in these lockdown situations, unable to communicate with family members for days on end. And even when they are able to wait in line and make that phone call, there's a line behind them. And so the pressure to keep that communication short, even when they're able to make it, it is, again, these are individuals who are entitled to the presumption of innocence and who our system has taken custody of. This treatment is deplorable, and it bears visible consequences in terms of both physical and mental and emotional health.
And in the land of the free, before you've been convicted of any crime, you can be locked up 23 hours a day without access to food or clean water, without enough time to take a shower, with paper clothes, without enough time to call your family, by the U.S. Department of Justice, without access to counsel. It's a disgrace to the U.S. government. I want to ask you, Ms. Whitehead, for your response to the concluding paragraph from the 2020 security assessment. Again, after years and years of warnings and internal BOP reports about gross deficiencies, misconduct, security lapses, here's how that 2020 security assessment that the subcommittee secured concluded, quote, U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta presents significant security concern for the Southeast region. Both national and local policies are being violated on a regular basis. The staff at USP Atlanta are quality staff, but without proper leadership, oversight, and accountability fail to follow proper security procedures. USP Atlanta requires immediate corrective action. And we've heard that before in internal audits. The demand by those investigators for action now. What was it like for you and others working in the facility to work in that environment?
When I arrived at Atlanta, my very first day, I sat in my car and I said, what the hell? Where does this happen in the Bureau of Prisons? I know that there are very good staff in Atlanta that want to follow policy, that want to do the right things. However, without that leadership, without being held accountable to follow those policies, it's a disservice to the staff and the inmates and the local community. The report saying that there must be immediate action is correct. However, I'm still waiting on that immediate action. When I was in Atlanta, I didn't see any action to the 2020 report. I didn't see any action to the July 2021 situation other than to move staff, move the management staff.
Thank you, Ms. Whitehead. Ranking Member Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go on. This concluding paragraph is quite short. It also says the lieutenant's office is not being held accountable and is in need of additional oversight. The staff morale appears average to below average. There appears to be a great deal of animosity between line and executive staff. Ms. Whitehead, can you describe the line of authority there? Who's the lieutenant? You don't have to name names, but I mean, just in terms of the line of management, what is the lieutenant's office?
So there's line staff. The lieutenant's office is the first line supervisors of correctional services.
So this would be right underneath the warden.
Right underneath the captain. So it's the
So
warden.
it's the warden has captains reporting to him?
At Atlanta, the captains report to the associate wardens. The associate warden reports to the warden. So therefore, the lieutenants are the first line supervisors. The captain would be the second, the associate warden the third, and the warden is the fourth inside the institution.
Okay. So basically 4 layers of management inside the prison.
Absolutely.
And then the warden reports to the regional director.
Yes.
So it seems like this report is really calling out the lieutenants. I mean, 4 layers down. I mean, again, I've managed things in the past. I first go to the top, recognize an awful lot of things happen underneath, and the top management may be unaware of it. But I think it's interesting to note that this report really focuses on the 4th line of management inside that prison.
It does.
I mean, can you explain why they're, what's wrong with the top 3 layers that they're not providing proper oversight to the lieutenants? I mean, is that where the power is? Is the lieutenant level, is that where the Atlanta Way got developed? And the other
No.
3 layers are just ignoring it?
No, it's a collective problem. As far as that report goes, it talks a lot about correctional services, about making rounds, about conducting searches. The lieutenant's office is pretty much responsible for the training the officers in those areas. And the suicide reports and that August 2020 report indicates staff were not conducting searches, staff were not making rounds. And if the lieutenants are making the rounds and supervising the staff, the correctional services staff, then that report indicates some of those things shouldn't have happened. It's a very tight institution, the different levels. So the captain communicates with the lieutenants on a daily basis. The associate warden communicates with the lieutenants on a daily basis. So therefore, if the lieutenant knows what's going on, then the captain should know. And then the captain should let the warden and the associate wardens know. So there's no, it's not correct that the upper 3 levels didn't know what was going on either.
So it says there's animosity between line and executive staff. So define line. Is executive staff the top 2 layers, 3 layers, 4 layers? I mean, what are they? Where's the animosity occurring?
The executive staff is the top layer. The line staff would be the first layer. A lot of the line staff members...
Well, define it in terms of the lieutenants, captains, what we were talking about earlier.
Okay. So the line staff is the first, that's the line staff. Their very first line of supervisor would be the lieutenant's office.
So where's, in this report, do you know where's the animosity between the first line staff and the lieutenant's office and above?
It appears that it is between the first line staff and the lieutenant's office, and then it appears that lieutenant's office have issues with the next level from that report.
So Dr. Ramirez, can you explain why there's all this animosity?
In my experience at Atlanta, the bargaining staff, meaning the officers, the secretaries, oftentimes give pushback to their first line supervisors, so the lieutenant, as is referenced there.
I'm just saying, you said the bargaining staff that'd be the unionized workers?
Yes, sir, that's what they mean by line staff.
Lieutenant above are outside the union?
Yes, sir.
So there's one potential fault line, huh?
So in my experience, what I've witnessed at Atlanta was oftentimes the lieutenants would attempt to address an issue. The line staff may push back, and it created animosity because the captain, the associate warden, and the warden expect a job to be done. The lieutenant is, you know, in my experience, I've witnessed them being very frustrated with being unable to get whatever done.
So is that because they simply can't enforce the directives because of the union won't allow it to be enforced? I mean, is there some labor management issues here that is part of this? And is the Atlanta way, is that really a bottom-up phenomenon, that it's the unionized workers that have created this Atlanta way, and line management simply can't enforce anything for whatever reason?
I certainly think that there are challenges with the union and management at Atlanta. I would also say, as I mentioned in my testimony, that the agency's accountability for any type of staff misconduct, that entire process is so convoluted. If an employee is...
When you say staff accountability, is that disciplining the union, the bargaining?
Disciplining any staff member.
Anybody?
Yeah, so...
let me just, because I want to get to one other question, because I think it was Dr. Ramirez, I think in your testimony you talked about teachers and classes. And there's plenty of staff to teach, but you've only seen one course being conducted there. My guess, we're going to hear from the director, and you know, it's always a staff issue, it's always a money issue, and sometimes it certainly is. Can either one of you explain why you've got teachers and education staff and no classes going on, except for that one instance?
Again, at least in my experience, what I witnessed in Atlanta, it was very difficult to account for the staff. There was quite a bit of animosity, not only between the line staff and management, but also between staff who were not Atlanta staff, meaning we came from other institutions.
The outsiders. The
outsiders. So there was quite a bit of divide between the staff. And so it made for a somewhat cat and mouse game at times.
Ms. Whitehead, do you have a comment on that, or?
Dr. Ramirez is right on point.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson, and thank you again so much to our witnesses for this panel for your courage, for coming to speak out about what you've experienced at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta. This concludes Panel 1, and the hearing will be in recess until approximately 11:30 a.m. while we vote. Ranking Member Johnson, you're excused with gratitude from the subcommittee. To order. We will now call our second panel of witnesses for this morning's hearing. Michael Carvajal is the Director of the Bureau of Prisons. He has served in the Bureau of Prisons for the past 30 years, most recently having served as the Assistant Director for the Correctional Programs Division, after which he was appointed to the position of Director of the Bureau of Prisons in February 2020. Director Carvajal, thank you for being here. It is the custom of this subcommittee to swear in all witnesses, so at this time I would ask you to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you, Director Carvajal. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. We will be using a timing system today, and Director Carvajal, all of your written testimony will be printed in the record in its entirety, but we would respectfully ask you try to limit your oral testimony to no more than 5 minutes. You may begin with your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here voluntarily to speak on behalf of more than 35,000 corrections professionals who diligently support the Bureau's critical law enforcement mission. I want to stress that what happened in Atlanta is unacceptable. We recognize the gravity of the alleged misconduct at that facility, and in July of 2021, we determined that it was in the best interest of the institution to take significant action. We reassigned staff, transferred inmates, lowered the security level, and began updating infrastructure at the facility. Importantly, we refocused the staff towards changing the culture. The Bureau has expended significant resources, implemented corrective actions, meant to secure that USP Atlanta's operational compliance, meant to ensure USP Atlanta's operational compliance with policies and expectations. Regional leadership routinely visits the institution to provide oversight and review progress. In April 2022, I conducted a site visit to personally inspect the facility and assess the culture. I found that the staff to be receptive of and motivated by the recent changes that we instituted, and I observed firsthand the substantial physical improvements for the ongoing repairs. The regional office recently conducted a security assessment. While the report is not yet final, preliminary findings indicate that corrective actions have increased staff training, enhanced security measures, internal controls, improved internal auditing, and strengthened inmate and staff accountability. To address the aging infrastructure at USP Atlanta, we temporarily closed housing units to make necessary renovations. As repairs are completed and units are reopened, inmates will be returned to a safer environment. We are also in the process of upgrading the infrastructure and the installation of fiber optics that will support more modern security systems. That said, our ability to complete this critical work, including the replacement and addition of security systems and cameras, depends on our ability to fund these projects. For context, the current backlog of major modernization and repair projects throughout the Bureau is approximately $2 billion. However, over the last 10 years, the Bureau has received an average of $95 million annually to address these projects. This gap means that we must continually make difficult decisions about what projects to prioritize throughout the agency, which creates challenges when addressing infrastructure issues at 100-year-old institutions such as USP Atlanta. We continually strive to improve suicide prevention efforts within the BOP. Inmate suicide rates historically run lower than those of the general public. In recent years, we have taken meaningful steps to reduce the likelihoods of suicides at USP Atlanta and agency-wide. For example, in the spring of 2021, we created a task force to review strategies to reduce single celling, revised our suicide prevention policy, enhanced reconstruction follow-up procedures, and expanded use of reintegration housing programs. We also provided additional suicide prevention training and added 100 new positions to our psychology services, with at least 50 more anticipated this fiscal year. Properly addressing misconduct is also an agency focus. The Bureau employs multiple levels of oversight intended to ensure that its institutions are operating according to policy. This includes reviews performed by central and regional offices, local institutions, and outside entities. In addition, all staff have a responsibility to protect inmates and each other by reporting misconduct. In fact, failure to report misconduct is a policy violation, and all potential violations are referred to the appropriate investigative authorities. We are constantly looking for ways to strengthen this oversight and do better. Part of the Bureau's effort to curb misconduct includes contraband interdiction. We continue to combat the threat of contraband such as drugs, weapons, and cell phones, which are introduced into our institutions through ever-evolving methods. In addition to our standard security practices, we are currently working on several new systems to address this issue, and we have provided supplemental training to staff. The Bureau has made significant strides in addressing these staffing needs over the past few years, and we created a national recruiting office which uses creative methods in marketing to attract candidates. They also target recruitment efforts at institutions that have difficulty attracting applicants. Increasing and maintaining our staffing within appropriated funding levels remains a priority. In 2021, we hired over 3,000 staff, and this year we've added over 1,200 new staff. We have proven that we can hire, and although hiring is not an issue at the majority of our locations, we are routinely outbid by competing corrections or law enforcement agencies that pay higher wages. Accordingly, we continue to consider how we can use additional incentives and hiring flexibilities so that we can be more competitive. USP Atlanta is currently staffed at nearly 90%, while the inmate population is approximately 42%. Recruitment and retention efforts are ongoing to maintain institution staffing at a safe and appropriate level. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these issues with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Carvajal, for your opening statement. You became Assistant Director for the Correctional Programs Division in August of 2018. Without objection, I'll enter into the record the BOP's job description for that role, providing, quote, national policy direction and daily operational oversight of correctional services. You were appointed Director in February 2020. Is it fair to say you've overseen corrections across the BOP from 2018 to present?
Yes, Senator. As part of the leadership team for the agency, that is correct.
Thank you, Director Carvajal. And you would agree with me, sir, that as Director, you're responsible for what happens at this agency?
Senator, as the agency head, I am overall responsible for everything that occurs at the agency.
Thank you, Director Carvajal. The buck stops with you, yes?
As you were aware, we have a very large and complex organization, so there's a clear delineation of authority. The way our system is set up, as a director, as I stated, yes. Every facility has a senior level manager, a CEO, chief executive officer, who's responsible for every facility. Above him is a regional director.
Understood, Director Carvajal, but my time's limited and the buck stops with you, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and I would suggest leaving the microphone on just in the interest of time. It is the mission of the Bureau of Prisons to confine, quote, offenders in the controlled environments of prisons and community-based facilities that are safe, humane, cost-efficient, and appropriately secure. That's according to the BOP, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. And if BOP is not doing these things, the buck stops with you, correct?
As I stated, Senator, ultimately I'm responsible for everything that occurs in this agency, but this is a very large and complex organization. You have to...
Director Carvajal, I appreciate it's a large and complex agency, but you are the director. I think we've established that the buck stops with you. As you know, USP Atlanta is a prison complex that holds pretrial detainees, meaning people who have been charged with crimes but not yet convicted. And as you know, in our country, they are presumed innocent. During our investigation, we have uncovered horrific reports of conditions of incarceration for all prisoners at USP Atlanta, but in particular for the presumptively innocent pretrial detainees. What, in brief, Director, does it mean for a detainee in your custody to be presumptively innocent?
Senator, I'm not sure I understand your question.
What does it mean for a detainee in your custody to be presumptively innocent?
Precisely that they're presumed innocent till proven guilty. They're going through the system. They're pretrial.
That's right. They're presumed innocent until proven guilty. A federal judge in the Northern District of Georgia wrote a letter to the warden of USP Atlanta in January of this year, which I entered into the record earlier in this hearing. I think it's an extraordinary letter. This is from January of this year. It cites credible accounts. This is a federal district judge, in fact, the chief judge for the district panel, of the following issues at USP Atlanta, particularly for pretrial detainees who are presumptively innocent. Quotes, rats in the building, roaches in the food, poor nutrition and emaciation, lack of access to hygiene products, lack of access to medical care, including prescription medication. Quote, a month of 24-hour solitary confinement with only a Bible for entertainment or reading. Quote, a week with only a paper jumpsuit and paper blankets for an inmate on suicide watch without mental health treatment or medication. Have you seen this letter before today?
I would have to actually see it, Senator. I get lots of letters, and I'm sure my staff are familiar with it.
But you have not seen this letter until today?
No.
Do you understand that several of the witnesses we have heard from today have also cited unacceptable conditions of incarceration, particularly for pretrial detainees? You heard that testimony?
The testimony on the panel before, no,
Yes.
I did not hear
You
it.
did not hear that testimony. Understood. We'll make sure to get you a copy. For a facility in as dire straits as U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta, where the inmate population's been depopulated by somewhere around 50% as a result of extraordinary measures in the middle of 2021 after massive amounts of contraband and weapons were found, after years and years of documented failures, why would you not be aware of a letter from the chief judge on the Northern District of Georgia citing rats, roaches, emaciation of detainees, lack of access to hygiene products? You wouldn't be aware of that? No one brought that to your attention?
Well, Senator, that's precisely why I was describing how our organization works. We have a regional director that is responsible for oversight of that facility along with the CEO. That is precisely why when I did become aware of the issues at Atlanta, I took the action that we took. That's precisely why we took that action, because when it did rise to my level, it rose to my level and we took immediate action. We did the things that we did, including reducing the population, reassigning the leadership team so that we could address the cultural issue that had developed there.
Thank you, Director Carvajal. Now, you took over as the Director of Correctional Services, Assistant Director for Correctional Services in 2018. You would have familiarized yourself with some of the most significant problems at major BOP facilities entering that role, yes?
If it was brought to my attention, Senator, again, Assistant
If it was brought to your
Director-
attention, or did you proactively familiarize yourself with conditions
Senator, I
at
believe
facilities?
it's important for you to understand how our organization works. Regional directors have primary responsibility oversight for those facilities. Assistant directors are more at the central level headquarters who are in charge of implementing policies and ensuring that we follow the rules and regulations. There are distinct differences between those. It is assumed that the regional director will provide oversight, and they are responsible to ensure compliance with policies, rules, and regulations at the local level.
Thank you, Director Carvajal. You said you took immediate action when these issues were brought to your attention. November 2018 suicide investigation found that staff who initially responded to the medical emergency did not appear to have a sense of urgency. You were the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs. August 2019 inspection by the Southeast Regional Office reported missing weapons, significant failures to follow use of force, medical and rape prevention policies, improper or non-use of medical detectors. At that point, you were the Assistant Director for Correctional Services. August 2020 suicide investigation, I believe now you're the Director, says, quote, "We've made many of the same recommendations noted in this report, the need for attention to detail, adherence to BOP policy, and regard for human life among correctional services staff." What does it mean to you to hear, as the Director of Bureau of Prisons, a report from your own investigators that staff at this facility lack regard for human life?
It's completely unacceptable, Senator. That's precisely why I took the actions that I did when I became aware of it.
Would it surprise you to learn that the BOP's own internal documentation show that it was aware of these conditions at USP Atlanta as far back as 2015?
I am now aware of that, Senator. That's precisely why we took the actions that we did in reassigning the leadership team and looking at the way the structure works. The regional director is responsible to implement and make sure that the compliance with those things, and it is apparent that we had an issue there. When it rose to my level as the director of the agency, we took immediate action.
So just to be clear, and
why we did
then
what we
my
did.
time will be up and we'll return to Ranking Member Johnson, but when you were the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs, it had not risen to your level that at this facility where BOP internal investigators had for more than half of a decade noted and referred to BOP leadership significant deficiencies, some of them life-threatening, major security lapses. You were not aware that there were reports of missing weapons, failures to follow use of force, medical and rape prevention policies, improper or non-use of medical detectors or spectrometers, failure to conduct rounds in the SHU, deficient inmate disciplinary processes. These are the BOP's own internal investigative records. You were the Assistant Director at the national level for correctional programs. Were you or were you not aware in 2019 that these conditions prevailed at this facility? It's a yes or no question.
Senator, as I stated, the regional director has oversight, primary responsibility. We have internal processes in place where we speak about these issues.
So you were not aware?
I did not have primary responsibility over that area.
You say you didn't have responsibility. My question is, were you aware?
I don't recall, Senator, without knowing. I truthfully, we have a lot going on in a very large, complex organization. I assure you that if I was aware, as with anything, I would have conducted or taken action.
Thank
It
you,
was a
Director
primary
Carvajal. My time's
responsibility.
up, and I yield to Ranking Member Johnson.
So, Mr. Director, thanks for coming here. Let's try and clarify things just in terms of the organization. I've been in large organizations, and you have line operational authority, and then you have staff over here doing human resources and other types of things, and they are completely separate. Is that kind of what your testimony is when you were the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs? You were really outside of the line operational authority, and it wasn't your responsibility to be aware of exactly what was happening operationally within the prisons?
That is correct, Senator. I appreciate the opportunity to explain this. As a director of the agency, I'm overall responsible. The buck stops with me. However, our organization is very large. Assistant directors at the headquarters level are responsible for implementing policies and procedures. The operational daily oversight of a facility is the primary responsibility of the regional director, and more importantly, the CEO of that facility. So by analogy, let me make it like this. A prison is like a city. The warden would be like the mayor, responsible. If they have issues or need assistance, they report up to the regional director, who would be, in this case, by analogy, like a governor. The central office being like federal assistance. Without that information and requests coming up to us, we are not directly involved in that. We also have the approval of the deputy director or the director to get involved in those operational issues.
Okay, so again, I think that's clarified. Do you know generally when you first became aware of the problems in Atlanta? Because you've served in a bunch of other correctional facilities. When did it hit your radar screen?
It hit my radar screen when I took the action. We have a lot going on. We have lots of facilities. There's no possible way. That's why we have a delineation.
Okay, so when you became aware of it, you took immediate action in the summer of 2021.
Yes.
Okay. When was the first time you ever heard? Have you ever heard the phrase "the Atlanta way"?
I heard that phrase when this became aware, and as we were getting reports back about that's how we determined that there was a cultural issue and a breakdown there, an obvious one. That's why we took the actions we did to reassign the leadership team.
So which members of the leadership team, you don't have to name names, I mean, give me the functions, who did you replace?
Well, we looked at all of the leadership team. We started with the warden and the executive leadership, and we certainly reassigned them for various reasons. And then the majority of the leadership team, all middle managers and above, because the obvious breakdown.
So are you talking about the mayor and his staff, or are you talking about the governor? And I'm using their analogy.
Yes.
I mean, did you replace anybody at the regional center?
The mayor and his staff, and according to the analogy, the regional director was due to mandatory retire in October. I made the decision to replace him with a new regional director approximately 5 months early.
Okay. As the chairman pointed out, though, you took those actions in the summer, didn't fix the problem. You're getting, and I'll take you at your word that you had not seen that letter from the judge, but in January 2022, it's still pretty shocking conditions at Atlanta. So how close were you monitoring the situation and the effectiveness of your corrective action?
Well, as I stated, Senator, that I made a visit there in April to ensure that things were
April of 2022.
April of 2022. And this is an ongoing challenge at old facilities. The warden, I know, is on it. What I observed there was that they were addressing these issues. We have constant challenges every day. When we become aware of them, we address them. I would expect that when that letter came in, that the current warden, the permanent warden there, is addressing those issues immediately. And that's what we would expect at any facility.
So Ms. Whitehead, in her testimony, which you didn't hear, when she returned, she served in Atlanta in the early 1990s, came back, tail end of her career, and her testimony was that she was shocked at the conditions. And again, you've seen other prisons, you've been in different correctional facilities, you know how the procedures ought to work. When you first became aware of what was happening in Atlanta, what was your reaction?
Exactly as I stated, Senator, it's absolutely unacceptable. That's why we took the actions we did.
So I was, again, you didn't hear the testimony, I was trying to determine who really was in charge. We kind of went through the the regional directors, then there's basically 4 layers of line management, ending at the lieutenant. So you've got the warden, and you've got captains, and you've got, I guess, social workers and then you've got the lieutenants. Then you have as I think she called them, those in the bargaining unit. So you have the union line employees. One of the conclusions of the 2020 report was that the lieutenant's office is not being held accountable and is in need of additional oversight. And then it talked about how there appears to be a great deal of animosity between line and executive staff. Again, having run organizations, I realize sometimes people at the top, information is being, it just doesn't filter up. I mean, I got that. People cover things up. They don't want to let the boss know, that type of thing. Do you have, having looked into this, do you have an analysis of what went so haywire? Why things were so wrong for so long in Atlanta? I mean, do you have, other than, I know you took care of some management team, but, was there a union component to this? Animosity between the union line staff and management?
Well, we do have a collective bargaining agreement, and the union does represent the line staff, but the issue, the breakdown that happened here, which was completely unacceptable, was the cultural issue there of line staff not being held accountable. A failure to follow policy is unacceptable. We have to have leaders and managers that enforce and hold people accountable. That's why we made the decision to remove the team, because they were not holding line staff who do the job accountable.
So so again, you got replace the warden, to replace captains?
I believe it was in the summer of 21, the captain, the associate warden, the captain who's considered the chief of police in that city, the associate warden were both removed from their positions because of their failures. The warden was eventually removed. Keep in mind that we have due process and we have to respect their rights too. We eventually removed the warden, so we had some actings. And then when I became aware of the overall cultural issue, which is completely unacceptable, we made a tough decision by removing the entire management team. These are all individuals. This was not people.
Does that include lieutenants and every?
Yes.
So did you bring those in from other facilities then?
Yes, we did.
Okay, and when did you make that move?
It was ongoing. In fact, there may be some that are still. It's an ongoing process because we do have to make sure that our employees have rights. We're not doing this. We are following personnel guidelines.
So, if I have the indulgence of the chairman here, did you ever have an overall meeting with individuals in the bargaining unit, the line guards? Did you ever have did you ever meet with the lieutenants? I mean, what did you do, or were you just kind of talking to the warden and the captains when you went in there and did your analysis?
I did not. That occurred below me, the different meetings. When I toured in April, I walked around that facility and interacted with all staff. In fact, my goal was to meet and speak to as many staff as possible in an informal environment. I answered many questions. I got lots of questions, and I had lots of interactions. That's why I visited the facility. That, again,
so how long was your facility, and how many times did you visit it?
I'm sorry?
How long was your visit, and how many times did you visit it?
That's the first time I visited there, and that was a day-long visit.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. Director Carvajal, going to begin with some citations from reports prior to your tenure in leadership and move to the present. July 2014, BOP scored USPA's Correctional Services Department as deficient. Deficiencies included unqualified staff assigned to armed posts, mishandled video footage, failure to conduct rounds, failure to use spectrometers to detect contraband, failure to implement suicide prevention policies. So let's just discuss a few of these. That specific deficiency, unqualified staff assigned to armed posts. Again, unqualified BOP staff assigned to armed posts shows up on the following correctional services audits for U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta. August 2015, December 2015, staff assist visit from November 2016, April 2019, while you are, as you earlier acknowledged, responsible for implementing policies and procedures for correctional services across the country. The October 2021 operational review, and the August 2020 security assessment. In your view, is it okay for a prison to assign unqualified staff to armed posts?
It's unacceptable, Senator.
So why didn't anyone fix this problem? And, you know, we can limit the discussion to when you were in senior leadership, April 2019, August 2020, October 2021.
I can't answer why it wasn't fixed. It's unacceptable. That's why we took the action we did. The warden of that facility should have been ensuring that his staff were conducting these follow-ups and making sure policy compliance, and ultimately the responsibility of that regional director who had oversight of that facility should have ensured compliance with those policies. It's unacceptable.
And you were not aware of any of these issues at USPA until last year. That's your testimony, correct?
Correct.
Understood. Let's talk about contraband interdiction efforts. In addition to the July 2014 audit, which found that staff had failed to use spectrometers to detect contraband, numerous other audits, again recognizing some of this is before your tenure in leadership, reported issues with contraband interdiction at the prison, including June 2015, staff not using the ion spectrometry device to test contractors and volunteers entering the prison. November of 16, metal detectors at the facility not maintained or inspected. May 2017, the Special Investigative Services Department was storing drugs, quote, in excess that are not needed as evidence and which could, quote, pose a potential threat to the security of the institution. Now, those were before you assumed supervisory responsibility over BOP's correctional services, or as you put it, responsible for implementation of policies and procedures. I would have expected that that official would have reviewed some of these reports from problematic facilities. That's water under the bridge. Let's talk about while you were in charge. August 2019, Assistant Director for Correctional Programs. Staff member entering the front lobby, setting off metal detectors, front lobby officer waving them through, one ion spectrometry machine broken at the west gate, all contractors entering the facility utilizing the front lobby and never screened. After, at this point, 5.5 consecutive years of reports indicating failures to prevent contraband from entering. January 2020, USPA staff are damaging the ion scan to prevent the device from being used. The machine has not been utilized in over 1 year. So just before you become director of the Bureau of Prisons, staff are, quote, engaged in, quote, purposeful destruction of drug detection equipment. That's 1 month before you became director. Now we continue, August 2020, you're the director. The review team observes multiple USPA staff triggering the metal detector in the front lobby but continuing into the prison unimpeded, allowing for unauthorized items to be introduced into the institution. October 2021, you're the director. Staff not routinely conducting pat searches, no documentation memorializing confiscated contraband. Repeated suicide reconstruction reports at the facility with the most suicides of any prison in the country about how the deceased inmates are high when they kill themselves. Are these acceptable practices for one of your prisons?
No, Senator, they are not acceptable. Precisely why we took the action that we did to cure the obvious cultural breakdown of people not following policy. Contraband interdiction is a daily process that relies on human beings doing their job, conducting searches and following proper rules and procedures. That's the basics of what we do. That's what ultimately led to this breakdown, but it takes leadership to provide oversight and make sure that these things are being done, and that is the ultimate responsibility of that warden, that leadership team, and the responsibility of the regional director to ensure compliance through oversight.
Yeah, respectfully, Director Carvajal, you're continuing to drive responsibility down the chain of command, but my question for you is this. You spend 2 years as the Assistant Director for Correctional Services, in your words, responsible for implementing policy and procedures at the national level. You're then the Director of the Bureau of Prisons, and you haven't familiarized yourself with any of this. You were unaware of any issues at USPA Atlanta. It's clearly your most troubled facility. You were ignorant of these problems until the middle of 2021. That's your testimony today.
Senator, things like that, because of the delineation of authority, would normally rise to my level. We have a chain of command and procedures that are followed.
So yes, you were ignorant of this until middle of 2021.
Senator, it was obvious that there was a breakdown, that did not reach my level, and that is why we took the action that we took. There is a delineation of authority, and we trust people. These are senior executive service people at the highest level who have that responsibility. We have very good policies, Senator, when they're followed. The breakdown here is that people consciously chose not to follow the policy. Not always. In those cases where it was a training issue, that's why we focused on training. It is our responsibility to make sure the staff know these policies and train them. It is ultimately the responsibility of every individual to follow those policies, and when people don't, to report misconduct. We have processes for all these things, and they all work very well. It isn't our policies that were broken. It was a failure to follow those policies, and that's why we took the action.
So, Director Carvajal, when in August 2020, the central office, under your command, conducted a security assessment of U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta and found that it posed, quote, a security risk to the southeast region of the United States, you were not aware of that?
I'm not certain which document you're referring to.
I'm referring to an August
I would have to see
2020 security assessment conducted by the central office under your authority, which found extensive, pervasive security failures and said, quote, U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta is a security threat to the southeastern United States. This was not a routine inspection. This was a security assessment carried out by the central office while you were the director of the Bureau of Prisons. You've testified here today you were unaware of any issues regarding this facility until the middle of 2021. Did you read the security assessment, which identified that one of your facilities was, quote, a security threat to the southeastern United States? Yes or no?
Senator, those reports normally would not rise to my level because
did not
they're
read it.
handled at that level of that authority.
Thank you, Director Carvajal. Ranking Member Johnson.
Director Carvajal, I think one of the more troubling security breaches was the fact that out of 263 cameras, 142 were inoperable or out of service. Has that been corrected?
Senator, we are in the process of correcting all those issues. I am aware of that. We nationwide, we have challenges with cameras, and Atlanta's no different, so we are correcting that problem. We have directed resources to address those issues.
Now, I would think that would be just a top priority because it's such a crucial asset in terms of protecting everybody. You know, Bureau of Prison personnel, inmates. I am concerned that here we are in July of 2022, and this was delineated in 2020, and now.
Well, Senator, as I stated in some of my remarks, that you have to understand the complexity that we have competing resources. Cameras are a great tool, first off, and we appreciate the support and the assistance to get those addressed. Cameras will not prevent contraband or crime or anything else. It's a tool that we use to manage it. The people are the ones doing their job.
Okay, I got you.
We are correcting it, though.
In your close of your testimony, you said you appreciate the opportunity to come before us. I don't envy your task. But let me ask you, why did it take a subpoena to get you to testify here?
Senator, I'm here voluntarily, and I would defer the process to the department, but I have appeared before Congress 5 times in my tour, and I am voluntarily here, and I welcome the legitimate oversight that you provide.
So I do realize we withdrew the subpoena, and I agreed with that decision because you did appear, but it took us issuing a subpoena to get you here. Were you involved in any discussions regarding your testimony here?
Senator, to the best of my knowledge, we've complied with all the requests.
No, no, please answer my question. Were you involved in discussions with anybody in the Department of Justice regarding you testifying before this committee?
I was aware of the request.
Were you involved in discussions? Did you talk to anybody in the Department of Justice about testifying here today?
When I became aware of the request, I have spoken to appropriate people in the Department of Justice.
Who did you speak to in the Department of Justice about testifying here today?
The Office of Legislative Affairs.
Who?
Mr. Wynn.
Okay, that's not that hard to provide a name. What did those discussions involve?
They involved making sure that we appropriately put the proper people up here to best answer your questions. In this case, operationally, I know we provided a couple of staff to answer questions that were interviewed and to make sure that we provided all the documents.
So did you have discussions once our subpoena was issued?
Yes.
What did those discussions involve?
Simply,
In other words, why didn't you just, because you appreciated the opportunity, why didn't you just, and why didn't the Department of Justice allow you to just appear before us and take advantage of the opportunity to discuss these issues with us.
Senator, I'll defer those questions to the department. I am here voluntarily.
Yeah, but you're here, and
Never said I
I'm
wouldn't
asking.
come.
The reason I'm asking these questions is congressional oversight has been significantly weakened over the years. I'm fully aware of it. I understand the full frustration of members of Congress trying to get the truth to the American public. That's our job, okay? But the agencies thumb their nose at Congress with impunity. And so to me, this is as important as your testimony is in terms of the problems at Atlanta. Maybe even a bigger issue for me in this hearing is, why did it take a subpoena to get the director of the Bureau of Prisons to come here and testify before us, to help us conduct our oversight? What is going on in the Department of Justice that they refuse to be transparent until Congress, the Senate, has to issue them a subpoena? You know, we bring department heads before our committees, have them testify before us. We almost always ask them the question, will you comply with congressional oversight requests? And to a person, because they apparently want the job, they always raise their hand and say, absolutely, I will cooperate with you, I will work with you, I will provide you the information that you request. And then they rarely do. Not on the important stuff, not the things that might embarrass their agency. I think they even look at presidents with the attitude that this too shall pass. That arrogance on the part of these agencies, on the part of the Department of Justice, the FBI, our federal health agencies, must end. It is that arrogance, it's that lack of transparency, it's that dishonesty that have Americans losing confidence in these institutions that, quite honestly, they need to have confidence in. It's an unsustainable state of affairs in a democracy when the chief federal law enforcement division, the FBI, can't be trusted. Can't be trusted to be non-political. Shows themselves to be completely political. When the Department of Justice blocks our ability to talk to one of their directors with legitimate oversight. When our federal health agencies have not been honest and transparent regarding a pandemic. So this lack of transparency has to end, and congressional oversight needs to be kicked into high gear. And again, I appreciate what the Chairman Ossoff has done in this one issue, but there are just so many more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. Director Carvajal, you no doubt pay attention to the number of inmate suicides in your various prisons, yes?
Yes.
And which BOP facility had the most inmate suicides over the past 5 years?
I don't know that information right off my head.
It's U.S. Penitentiary, Atlanta. I would think this would be a facility that would have been on your radar, even if just for the number of inmate suicides, leading the nation. November 2018, for example, at that time you're the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs. Inmate died by hanging. BOP investigation finds staff who initially responded to the medical emergency did not appear to have a sense of urgency. Officers did not conduct rounds prior to the suicide. Inmate orderlies were caught on camera passing contraband to inmates under their cell doors. Did that concern you at the time?
I'm certain it did, Senator. I believe that's part of the issue here is that we have been siloed in the past. That's part of the reason that we're looking at making these changes and improvements. That the Reentry Services Branch oversees a psychological branch. Correctional Programs Division was not responsible for
Hold on just a second. We're getting into the org chart again. Listen, just November of 2018, inmate died by hanging. No sense of urgency in the staff response. This is a BOP internal document. Officers did not conduct rounds prior to the suicide. Inmate orderlies were caught on camera passing contraband to inmates under their cell doors. You said in your previous round of questions that you were not aware of these issues at USP Atlanta until mid-2021. You weren't aware of this?
Senator, we have 121 facilities that at the highest level that I keep track of things. That's why the delineated authority goes
So this
down.
wouldn't have risen to your
I expect to be
level?
briefed by the appropriate people. In this case, would have been the regional director, the assistant director,
Yeah.
telling us there was issues at that facility.
So this wouldn't rise directly to your level?
Without going back and knowing the individuals, I'm notified of any suicide or major incident.
That's right.
Ongoing. I am notified of that. We have reporting procedures.
That's right,
When you-
because you're CC'd on the report. And that's why I'm having trouble with your testimony that you weren't aware of any issues at this facility until the middle of 2021. Because as the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs, you received the investigation reports for each of the suicides. Lack of urgency, failure to conduct rounds, inmate orderlies passing contraband under cell doors. Those came directly to you. So were you aware of these issues at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta prior to the middle of 2021?
Senator, we get all those reports, and part of our responsibility is to look at training and development, things of that nature. When I tell you I'm not aware specifically, I can't remember specifically what I did in that time. I do know
Okay,
that I
understood.
reviewed those
Your
reports.
testimony is that you
and
don't
we took
recall-
appropriate action to address those issues.
You took appropriate action. Okay, that was November of 2018. You're the Assistant Director of Correctional Programs. The report was sent to you. You say you took appropriate action. October of 2019, just under a year later, you're still in this position. Inmate died by hanging. Quote, staff delayed the initiation of life-saving measures. Staff failed to perform rounds before, during, and after the suicide. Same issues. So what action had you taken to resolve these issues at the facility with the most suicides of any prison in the federal system?
Well, we provide corrective action, internal controls. Keep in mind, Senator, that over time, when these repeat deficiencies and things, it's not always the same people in charge. That's the ongoing challenge that we face, that we have to continuously train staff. It's not always the same staff involved. So we see repeat deficiencies. That's the frustration of the nature of our business, is that we have we have over 35,000 staff. It's not the same people involved at all of these.
Yeah, 35,000 staff,
it's
but
an
you're
ongoing
here with us
challenge.
today, and you're the director. We're going to get back to these reports and this timeline in a moment, but I'm going to reserve the balance of my time, yield to my colleague, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Glad we had an opportunity to come back for the second panel. I know the first panel had a very focus and emphasis on U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta, but with a number of federal facilities in California that I've been hearing from, wanted to take the opportunity to raise a couple of these questions. My office has received reports that BOP personnel at FCI Mendota were flouting COVID protocols, leading to the transportation of COVID-positive detainees and spikes in infections. Now, Senator Feinstein and I sent a letter to the Attorney General seeking answers concerning these allegations back in April. However, the agency response we received failed to reply to our specific concerns raised concerning FCI Mendota. And Mr. Carvajal, I appreciate you looking through some notes here. Hopefully we can get some clear insight as to what's happening. So my first question is, how do you respond to the allegations that I'm raising here today that we first wrote about back in April?
Well, Senator, we certainly don't expect anyone to flout COVID. We have very good procedures in place, and they're followed. I'm generally aware of that letter, and we have 122 facilities. And again, I go back to that we have regional directors. We have processes in place to provide oversight. We take these allegations seriously. We look into them, and we do the corrective action. The continuous challenge is that it's different people. Zero tolerance for unacceptably not following policies. So we look into these things and we address them.
So you say there's protocols and they're followed. We send you a letter saying we're hearing protocols are not being followed, and it's a dangerous situation, this pandemic. And the response, again, is not informative or helpful whatsoever, other than we have protocols that are being followed, and if not, we're going to look into it. And we already communicated to you months ago that we understand they weren't being followed. So as part of our follow-up with you, I'm aware that BOP utilizes compliance review teams to ensure that facilities comply with protocols. Now, after Senator Feinstein and I raised concerns about FCI Mendota, was a compliance review team deployed to ensure compliance with COVID protocols?
Senator, I don't know in this particular instance, but we do use compliance teams. We also ensure that we follow CDC guidance and processes and guidelines. So I would expect that they were, again, delegated. I have 122 facilities. There's a delineation of authority, and I fully expect those follow-ups to be done, and when they're not, that we have procedures to address that.
So beginning to share the frustration with the chair here on lack of a definitive answer. Given what I've described so far, and if you're familiar with the letter, it seems like you were perusing it in your binder, would you agree that would be appropriate to deploy a compliance review team? And after such concerns are being raised?
Yes, Senator, and I don't know why we didn't. I will ask that question and follow up. I would expect that the appropriate regional director requested a team, or that the assistant director with oversight for that area would deploy a team. But I can't answer that right now because I don't know.
Let me try a different issue. Now, augmentation, the BOP practice involving the push of civilian employees into duties usually performed by correctional officers, has long been scrutinized. Unless you tell me you believe otherwise, I will continue. As of last year, nearly 1/3 of federal correctional officer jobs were vacant. That's a significant percentage. As a result, staff members who serve as cooks, teachers, and nurses have been forced to guard detainees. Just this week, my office received reports that at FCI Dublin, staffing has been so low that the drug treatment program had to be shut down. Now, this is clearly a dangerous and unsustainable situation. Mr. Carvajal, what efforts have you personally taken to overcome staffing shortages at BOP? Not what initiatives may be in place or efforts may be in place by others, your personal involvement in addressing staffing shortages.
Well, Senator, my personal involvement, as well as the agency, is it's a top priority. Staffing remains a concern. It has been a concern. We struggle like everyone to get employees, but we are using incentives. We're looking at offering more recruitment and retention incentives. We need to better our training. We certainly need to attract the candidates to the area. One of the challenges at Dublin, as I referred to earlier, is that we have trouble competing with the pay scale in that area. So we have a hard time attracting candidates. Certainly, staffing is a priority. An institution is safer when it's well-staffed, and we strive to add staff. I'd like to address the augmentation and make sure that everyone understands that all of our staff are equally trained. They're all federal law enforcement officers. They go through the same training. So although they may have a primary duty as working in food service or another discipline, which we certainly want them to do, the safety and security mission comes first. And oftentimes, we don't like doing it, but we have to complete that mission first in order for anything else to happen. So we have to use staff in those areas. They are properly trained. All of our staff are equally trained and expected to perform those functions as we call correctional workers first.
So you're saying nurses and teachers are equally trained and prepared to do the duty of all other correctional officers?
Senator, they go through the exact same training that our correctional officers go through.
Ongoing training, or?
Senator, that's one of the challenges that we're trying to do to improve the agency is conduct more training. When we have the luxury of doing that training, we try to do advanced training. We're implementing a new program for correctional officers, but at this point, all of our staff receive the same training. Annually, refresher training. There is no advanced training that correctional officers receive, Senator.
Well, that should ring alarm bells here as well. I know my time is running out, but let me just sort of conclude with this and emphasizing the point why vacancies are dangerous, both for detainees as well as for staff. You know, it's critical that trained guards be available to respond to critical situations so that those who are not trained to do so are not placed in harm's way. Again, the lives of both detainees and staff are on the line. Now, my office has also received outreach due to a number of detainee suicides at FCI Mendota. And according to reports, the latest suicide occurred while Recreation Department staff members were supervising detainees. Recreation Department staff members were supervising detainees. Mr. Carvajal, I don't believe that the staff members should perform duties that lie outside the scope of their employment, especially when it comes to correctional supervision. I want to ask additional questions here because the responses are a recurring theme. You say it's a priority, you say there's incentives, but the numbers, a third of the positions vacant shows failure, in my opinion. Something's got to change, and you're the person at the top. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Director Carvajal, I want to pick up where we left off in this discussion of suicides at USP Atlanta. And we noted that when you were the Assistant Director for Correctional Programs responsible for implementing policies and procedures nationwide, you directly received these suicide investigation reports. November 2018, officers not conducting rounds prior to the suicide, orderlies caught on camera passing contraband to inmates under their cell doors. October 2019, delayed initiation of life-saving measures, staff failure to perform rounds before, during, and after the suicide. Okay, then you assume the directorship. August 2020, inmate died by hanging, officer not conducting proper rounds, unsupervised inmate orderlies passing items under the cell doors to other inmates. If I could ask for some assistance closing the door, please. Same pattern, same issues, but your testimony today, and I want to be clear about this because, Director Carvajal, I have to be frank with you, I find it hard to believe that you weren't aware of these issues as you've testified until the middle of 2021, given that you had national responsibility for oversight and implementation of correctional programs. That's your testimony today as well. Given that you received these reports directly, given that internal BOP investigations found over more than half a decade this was one of the most troubled facilities in the entire country, your testimony today is nevertheless that until the middle of last year, you were unaware of this. If that's true, it suggests that the directorship of the Bureau of Prisons is an office that has no idea what's happening within the system of federal prisons. August 2020, here's what the investigation revealed. You're the director. Quote, once again, this reconstruction revealed complacency, indifference, inattentiveness, and a lack of compliance with BOP policies and procedures. By the way, the same policies and procedures for which you had national responsibility to implement in your prior role. Continuing the quote, these lapses contribute to a dangerous and chaotic environment of hopelessness and helplessness, leaving inmates to their own means to improve their quality of life. You were unaware of this. You had no idea this was going on at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta. That's your testimony today.
Senator, the Psychology Services Branch is under the Reentry Services Branch. We work, correctional programs works with them. Generally, those reports, they're routed to us. We get many reports. We have 122 facilities.
Director,
we work
it's a yes or no. Were you aware?
This.
Were you aware? The org chart,
Senator,
we've been through the org chart. Were you aware? Were you aware after you served for 2 years with national responsibility for the implementation of policies and procedures, when you were personally copied on reports citing severe deficiencies in the conduct of these officials that contributed to the death of inmates, were you aware prior to the middle of last year that there were serious problems at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta? I don't want the org chart. I want to know, were you aware, yes or no, prior to the middle of last year of these serious problems at U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta? Very simple question.
Senator, I was generally aware, but I do have responsibility for a very large organization.
Okay, you were aware.
Things happen.
You were aware.
everywhere.
Now let's discuss what action you took. When BOP's internal investigators reported that the corrections officers in this facility, and you were generally aware of the issues, we've now established that, lacked regard for human life, what action did you take? Let me ask another question. When in August 2020, your own head office, the central office, not the regional office, not the warden, not a staff assist visit, your office, August of 2020, a year before you earlier said you first became aware of these issues and took action, said that this facility was a security risk to the southeastern United States. What action did you take?
That's the responsibility of the regional director to take those actions, and that is why I took the action I took when it rose to my level.
It was a central office report. It was a BOP central office security assessment. August of 2020, the central office concludes, this facility poses a threat to the security of the southeastern United States. What action did you take?
I would expect that the assistant director and the regional directors take the appropriate action and brief us on that. That's what did not
But the buck
occur.
stops with you. We established that, didn't
Absolutely
we,
does,
Director?
Senator.
So you took no action, did
that
you,
didn't
Director
occur.
Carvajal?
If I didn't take action, it's because it wasn't brought to my attention. That was a failure. That's why when it did get on my radar, we took the actions we took.
You took no action, and the buck stops with you, correct?
Correct.
Let me read you some more excerpts from reports of suicide when you were the director of the Bureau of Prisons at this facility. Quote, the improper medical response represents gross indifference to preserving life and violates inmates' constitutional rights. November of 2020. Would it not be brought to the attention of the director of Bureau of Prisons that BOP investigators have found that there's gross indifference to the preservation of life and violations of constitutional rights in your facilities? If that is not the kind of thing that's brought to the attention of the director of Bureau of Prisons, we've got serious problems in this bureaucracy. Was that brought to your attention, November of 2020?
I don't recall, Senator, but that's precisely why we are making changes with the way that we're looking at the way that the Bureau is structured and looking at making changes. For that reason, it was an obvious breakdown in communication. There is much information in a large organization that comes to us, and I certainly expect people at that appropriate level to brief the deputy director and myself on these issues that should have been forefront of the radar. That's why we've taken the action we've taken.
November 14th, 2021, the Associated Press reports that more than 100 BOP workers have been arrested, convicted, or sentenced for crimes since the start of 2019, including a warden indicted for sexual abuse, an associate warden charged with murder, officers taking cash to smuggle weapons, and supervisors stealing property. Your response?
It's unacceptable. Their process of investigations, we have over 35,000 staff, 100 since 2019. Even one is unacceptable if it occurred and they're being investigated, but that's less than 0.5% of our staff. The majority of our staff do the right things.
Less than
and when they
100,
don't, we expect them to be
100 workers under your direction in less than 2 years convicted or sentenced for crimes. Have you been successful in rooting out criminal activity at the Bureau of Prisons under your tenure?
We absolutely think that's unacceptable. We expect people to follow the law. We take an oath. We are sworn law enforcement officers, and we have processes, and we work with outside entities to hold staff accountable. We take all allegations very seriously, but there is an investigative process that they must go through, and we respect those processes and support them.
Is the Bureau of Prisons able to keep female detainees safe from sexual abuse by staff? Yes or no?
We strive to do that.
Is the Bureau of Prisons able, I'm sure you strive, is the Bureau of Prisons able to keep female detainees safe from sexual abuse by staff? Yes or no?
Yes, we are.
You are.
In those cases, when things happen, we hold people appropriately accountable.
You are the director at a time when one of your prisons is known to staff and inmates as a, quote, rape club. The Associated Press reports that, quote, inmates say they've been subjected to rampant sexual abuse by correctional officers and even the warden, and were often threatened or punished when they tried to speak up. That's at Dublin. Is that true?
That case is under investigation. I won't talk about the specifics, but I will tell you that it's unacceptable, and we expect people to be held accountable for breaking the law if it occurred. We have taken measures to address those issues, And I find it completely unacceptable, as do most of the staff. But everyone has a responsibility. We cannot address something to that nature if we were unaware of it. And in those cases, when we became aware of it, we should be doing something
Is
about
it
it.
true? Is it true that one of your prisons is known to staff and inmates, this is Dublin, as a, quote, rape club? Is it true?
I do not know that anyone
don't know.
calls it a rape club.
Well, okay, this is the Associated Press reporting that staff and inmates at FCI Dublin call it, quote, rape club, and that, quote, inmates say they have been subjected to rampant sexual abuse by correctional officers and even the warden, and were often threatened or punished when they tried to speak up. Do you know if that's true? Is that true?
It is being investigated, and if anything
I understand.
that was
My question
true,
is
we are
if it's
going to
true.
hold people accountable.
Is it true?
I do not know if it's true.
You don't know if it's true.
It is
Have
being
you?
investigated. There
have you
is
s-
a process, Senator, that we respect, and it's going through. I do not go by what the Associated Press or anyone says. We have processes to investigate these things. It's unacceptable for any place to be known as a rape club or condone that. We don't expect it from our staff, and we certainly take the priority and the safety of all inmates in our custody, as well as our staff, completely serious. That kind of language is unacceptable, and we don't expect anyone to use it.
2021, the U.S. settled a lawsuit brought by 15 female inmates at a BOP facility in Florida, that's Coleman, who were raped, assaulted, and harassed by male officers. In one particularly harrowing account, an inmate said she was raped every Wednesday for 6 months at a warehouse where she'd been assigned to work. Is the Bureau of Prisons able to keep female detainees safe from sexual abuse by assault? Your testimony remains yes?
Yes.
"15 female inmates raped, assaulted, and harassed by male officers. A woman raped every Wednesday for 6 months at a warehouse. And your testimony today is that the Bureau of Prisons is able to keep female detainees safe from sexual assault."
Senator, we have a complex mission, and if we could stop that from happening completely, we would. We would have zero suicides, no crimes would ever be committed, and we would absolutely not allow anything like that to happen. In those cases, when they do, we hold people accountable. There is a process. I can't speak to what happened at Coleman because I wasn't involved in it. I wasn't in the process of it. I am familiar with what you're speaking about. It makes me sick to see those things happen. And we try our best to prevent them. And when we can, we do. And when we can't, we do something about it. And that's the best I can tell you. If I could have kept that from happening, Senator, it never would have happened.
Director, you've a number of times said you have a complex organization, and I don't doubt that. I don't think the chairman doubts that. When you have a complex organization, you need reporting mechanisms in place to hold people accountable. I think what I find most troubling in here is the fact that there weren't those reporting systems in place. Apparently, it's just structural, that these regional directors or these divisions are kind of fiefdoms of their own and apparently don't seem like they're responsible for reporting to the director at all. That's a real problem. I think that the whole purpose of oversight is to understand what's happening, where the breakdowns are occurring so we can fix it. So, first of all, do you agree with that assessment, that there just simply wasn't the reporting mechanism that you could, these reports be written, I know the August 31st, 2020 report that I've been referring to, that's a memorandum for the regional director of the Southeast region. But again, something with those types of revelations, it ought to just automatically go up to the top. Again, when I ran an organization, I always tell the people that reported to me, don't be making decisions that I really need to be aware of, that I need to be making that decision. Don't take that responsibility onto yourself. That's the whole job of being the boss, to get the tough ones, to hear the really bad news that needs to be corrected. So again, just to tie into what the chairman has been talking about, is your testimony that you were just literally completely out of the loop of all these reports to these regional divisions, and that's the way the system's supposed to work?
No, Senator, and I agree that that's one of the challenges. We've taken steps to look at reorganization or looking at this. I think we've been stuck in a silo. I believe that's what some of these breakdowns occurred. We put a lot of trust in our senior level. These are senior executive service members at the top of the leadership. They have delineated authority, and we expect them to use that good judgment.
But listen, in any organization, you delineate authority. But the person in charge, the people in charge, again, it's not just you, it's the Attorney General. It's people who serve in the Department of Justice. I wanted one follow-up question. You did, in response to my question in terms of who did you discuss your testimony with, you did say an individual from the Office of Legislative Affairs. Is that the only person you discussed your testimony with? Inside the Department of Justice, that's the only person you discussed your testimony with?
Yes, Senator. Me directly, my staff work with their staff. That is who
You didn't talk to anybody else inside the Department of Justice about the subpoena that was issued, whether or not you were going to appear here today or not, about your testimony. You only spoke to one person in the Department of Justice. That's your testimony here.
Yes, Senator, not regarding this particular this particular issue. I worked through the Office of Legislative Affairs.
Okay, again, you seem to, what do you mean by this particular issue? About testifying here, cooperating with this committee in terms of our oversight?
Senator, you asked me who I spoke to specifically about this subpoena.
About this subpoena. Okay, what about, did you talk to anybody in the Department of Justice about the overall effort by this subcommittee to investigate and conduct oversight over the Bureau of Prisons? Did you talk to anybody in the Department of Justice regarding that?
I have not. My staff work closely with the Department of Justice, but I have not spoken to anybody directly about this committee's work.
It's almost willful ignorance. And that's what I find disturbing. It almost appears to be willful ignorance. Don't want to know what's happening below me. Don't want to hear about rapes. Don't want to hear about suicides. Well, that's up to, we've got the structure set up. It's going to be the regional directors. It's their problem. That's what needs to change here. People have to be held accountable. Again, I appreciate you coming here. What I don't appreciate is how difficult it was to get you here. And I don't appreciate, again, from my standpoint, the obstruction to this committee's investigation, our oversight, by somebody in the Department of Justice. I don't think it was this fellow from the Office of Legislative Affairs. I think somebody else or some other persons didn't want this hearing to occur, did not want to cooperate with this investigation. So again, I give kudos to the chairman for pursuing this against resistance and obstruction. And I think we see why this is so important. There are some serious problems. I'm sorry, they have not been effectively addressed. They haven't. I wish they had been. These are outstanding issues for years. Somebody's got to be held accountable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. And Director Carvajal, that's going to conclude the questions today. I want to close just with this. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that we're talking about human beings in the custody of the U.S. government. We heard from a representative of the Federal Defender's Office, emaciated from lack of nutrition, with vermin crawling through their cells into which they're overcrowded and locked down for 23 hours a day with inadequate time to take a shower, call their family, call their lawyer, people who have been convicted of no crime, pretrial detainees. Inmates hanging themselves in federal prisons, addicted to and high on drugs that flow into the facilities virtually openly. And as they hang and suffocate in the custody of the U.S. government, there's no urgent response from members of the staff. Year after year after year, It's a disgrace. And for the answer to be, other people deal with that. I got the report, I don't remember. It's completely unacceptable. Now, these issues are deeper than your leadership personally. This is clearly a diseased bureaucracy. And it speaks ill to our national values and our national spirit that we let this persist year after year and decade after decade. And if this country is going to be real about the principles at the core of our founding and our highest ideals, there got to be change at the Bureau of Prisons, and it has to happen right now. And with your departure and the arrival of a new director, I hope that moment has arrived. And with that, the hearing's adjourned.